Good evening. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. This is the Spring 2011 College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean's Lecture Series. My name is Michael Whiteford, and I am the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And it is my very special pleasure to be hosting this event along with many others. Tonight's lecture is the 10th in the Dean's Lecture Series, which highlights faculty excellence and achievement in teaching, discovery, and outreach in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. The most outstanding members of our faculty have been invited to present lectures from their varied areas of scholarly experience. These lectures stimulate intellectual discussion among our faculty, staff, students, and the greater Iowa State community. I want to thank the ISU Lectures Program for their role in helping us sponsor this event. As always, they do a wonderful job. Tonight's lecturer is Professor Deborah Marquardt. Deborah joins a distinguished list of LAS faculty members who have been part of this series since it was inaugurated in 2006. The researchers and scholars have shared their knowledge on a wide range of stimulating topics that goes from woody bamboo plants to the physics of the curveball, West African primates to dead poets, Old World Mediterranean antiquities to tomorrow's futuristic nanotechnology, humor in Vladimir Putin's Russia to the very basics of molecular biology. The depth and breadth of our speakers is astounding, and it mirrors the academic diversity of our College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. We are indeed the heart and soul of Iowa State University. Tonight's lecture will be as equally informative and as enlightening as our previous presentations. Professor Deborah Marquardt will present, and I quote, "Art is long, life is short. The writer's struggle to create something that lasts," end of quote. She will discuss the artist's attempts to create something that collects meaning even long after the artist is gone. Deborah is a professor in the Department of English and part of the Masters of Fine Arts program in Creative Writing and Environment. In tonight's lecture, she will read from her work, including her forthcoming novel, A Formal Feeling Comes. Professor Marquardt is the author of 4 books, including From Sweetness, Poems, and The Hunger Bone, Rock and Roll Stories. Her work has received many awards, including a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, the Shelby Foote Nonfiction Prize, and a Pushcart Prize. Her most recent book, The Horizontal World, Growing Up Wild in the Middle of Nowhere, was awarded both the LA Lettres Award from the LA Magazine and the 2007 PEN USA Creative Nonfiction Award. Deborah Marquardt earned her bachelor's degree in social work in 1984 from Morehead State University. She picked up a Master of Liberal Arts at Morehead State University in Minnesota in 1990, and she earned a Master of Arts in Creative Writing at Iowa State University in 1993. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming tonight the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Spring 2011 Dean's Lecture Series speaker, Professor Deborah Marquardt.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Dean Whiteford. And I mentioned this earlier, but I'm obviously so honored to have been invited to give this lecture, and especially so since this is, I suppose, Dean Whiteford's final Dean's Lecture, and so I'll try to make it a good one. But first I want to thank him for being our Dean these years and seeing us through some very hard times, and I just want to thank you for that, Dean Whiteford. I also want to thank the Associate Deans, David Oliver and Zora Zimmerman and Arne Hullum, and for doing all that hard work for us, and thank you all for being here, so many familiar faces and friends and colleagues. And Laura Engelson, who worked really hard to make this event as beautiful as it has been. I appreciate it, Laura. I'm going to read from two different things, so you can see I have two different microphones here. This is very elaborate. I'm going to first read from an essay. It's only sort of parts of an essay because it would be too long to read. And so you'll hear, it's written in numbered sections, so you'll hear there are some numbers missing because there are parts that I sort of pulled out. And then I'll end by reading a short chapter from a novel that I'm working on right now that's set in Greece. And you'll hear a little bit about that novel here in the essay. And it's called Ephemera, Some Thoughts on Impermanence. And I suppose I wrote this essay last spring when I was in Greece doing research for the novel. And there were many things going on in Greece at that time, including some, there were some firebombing of banks. There were riots. They were trying to storm the Parliament building. It seemed like things were falling apart. My friends who teach in colleges in Athens could not meet with their students. The planes weren't running. The planes weren't flying. The ferries weren't going. I wanted to go to Crete, and I thought, well, I'm not going to go to Crete if the ferries aren't going because I don't know if I'll get back. And so I decided to stay on the ground, and I took the bus to Nafplio, which is perhaps the most beautiful place on earth, I think, and spent a couple weeks holed up in Nafplio, which isn't such a bad thing, and wrote this essay, Ephemera, Some Thoughts on Impermanence. 1. The thing is, I'm trying to finish my novel, but the water keeps coming in the basement. Not in the basement of the novel, but in the basement of my fiancé's house in Michigan, where I spend my summers gardening and writing. It's a strange feeling to go downstairs during an intense summer storm, as I did, just to unplug the computer and to notice that the corner of the tan carpet has darkened into a wet triangle. Stranger still, to watch the stains spread in the next few minutes under the writing desk, toward the floor lamp and file cabinets. I don't begrudge water. It can go wherever it wants. But even at that moment, watching it move through the room, it struck me as wrong. Water should not be here in the house, outwitting the maze of foundation wall and footings that architects designed centuries ago for this express purpose, to keep the inside in and the outside out. And even at that moment, I knew my response was irrational as I exited the room and closed the door behind me, thinking, maybe I didn't need to tell Tom about this information. Maybe he didn't have to know that his lovely 10-year-old house with vaulted ceilings and wood floors that he'd bought 9 months earlier, pouring all of his savings into, had sprung a leak. He was out in the flash flood street at the time anyway, wading thigh-high through water that had already come halfway up the front lawn. He was in the street, flailing away like a crazy person at the 2 plugged storm drains with a garden rake as flashes of lightning flew around him. He was trying to clear the drains of the wood chips from the neighbors' landscaping beds, which we'd seen wash into the street, riding on what appeared to be a creek that had begun to flow between the 2 houses across from us. When you buy a house, you stake a claim to a small spot on earth, which has the illusion of permanence. You trim and prune, fortify and defend. If the usual things try to enter, ants, mice, crickets, thieves, fixes can be found. But when 3.18 inches of rain falls in 23 minutes in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and you are, as we found out months later when emailing the drain commissioner, the last and lowest house to empty out of the watershed, plus your house has the bad taste to sit on a clay seam, well, then you're just screwed. Because once water has found its way into your house, it will always remember you. It will always find a way in. 3. The novel I'm writing is set in Greece from the perspective of an outsider. The idea first came to me in 1998 after I returned from my first trip to Athens, Corfu, and Andros with my then husband Peter, who is Greek American and whose grandparents immigrated to the U.S. in the 40s from different parts of Greece. Upon our return, after rolls of film were developed, I was surprised to discover that I'd taken very few pictures of people, not the dozens of his friendly relatives who appeared at the hotel each day in exponentially multiplying numbers. I'd not taken pictures of the beautiful tables of food, which we ate in their marble-floored open-air dining rooms, or of the seaside cafes around the island that they took us to, where we talked and laughed and drank wine as the sun extinguished itself into the Ionian. Nor had I photographed the narrow cobbled streets we drove through to get to the cafes, the little shops we walked past, the white sandy beaches, misty harbors with sailboats, or even the Venetian fort or the tan hills in the distance. Instead, I had shot roll after roll of olive trees up and down the terraced landscapes, each tree flashing green then silver in the wind, each one so unique and wizened, so human-looking, I suppose, that they must have seemed when I came upon them like old friends who must be remembered in photographs. People will say, "This olive tree was alive at the time of Christ," or "This tree witnessed the fall of the Roman Empire." But it's still uncertain exactly how old olive trees can live to be. On the island of Crete, for example, there's evidence on the basis of tree ring analysis of a 2,000-year-old olive tree with suspicion that it's much older. Several olive trees in the Middle East and Mediterranean around Greece, in Croatia, Italy, Palestine, and Israel have been identified as 2,000 years old or older. One tree in West Athens is referred to as Plato's olive tree because it's believed to mark the last vestiges of a grove where Plato's academy stood 2,400 years ago. Olive trees were mentioned in Homer and by Pliny the Elder. But evidence of the ancient is everywhere in Greece. Traveling around, it's not unusual for someone to point to an opening in the rock outcropping and say, "See, right there, that's where Zeus was reared," or "Oh, that's where Persephone was dragged down into Hades." Really? You want to say? God, I thought that was a myth. On my first trip to Greece, we were rushed around the island of Corfu by my husband's relatives. I suppose everyone needed to be satisfied that we'd been showed the expected sights. The gaudy Achaeon palace built by Emperor Franz Joseph for his wife, the spare sarcophagus of Saint Spiridon in Corfu town. The haste with which we were dispatched signaled to us that his relatives had done this 1,000,000 times. They even knew the best places to pose. "Here, stand here." They'd prop us up in front of a fountain or a blooming trellis of bougainvillea, a marble statue. "Click, click. Good. Now let's go eat." Then they drove us over to Paliakastritsa, which is a headland on the western shore of Corfu with a monastery and a cliff overlooking a bay that has the most aquamarine water I have ever seen. And I was looking down upon the water in stunned silence. My husband's cousin Nick pointed to a tiny island of rock just off the coast. "Remember how Poseidon punished the Phaeacians when they returned Odysseus to Ithaca?" he said. I combed through my fuzzy memories of the Odyssey. "He changed the ship and its sailors to stone after they dropped Odysseus off," he continued. "Well, that's it, right there." He pointed down to the small island. "That's the stone boat." Wow, really? I thought that was myth. 5. What is it about a place that inspires poems and stories to be written about it? Is it distance, a feeling of absence or separation that overtakes the writer so much that the place must be recreated? This must be the reason that when I was in Greece, during the winter of 2002 to work on my novel set in Greece, I spent each day feverishly writing about North Dakota, the result of which became my memoir, The Horizontal World. Even at the time, it made no sense to me. As I sat in my rented studio tucked into the steep hillside in Molivos on the island of Lesvos, with the views out the window overlooking my desk of the terracotta roofs descending down the side of the mountain to the blue patch of the Aegean. Through another window was the feathered shape of Mount Lepetimnos in the far distance, and all I could think and write about was the cold, flat, austere beauty of North Dakota. 6. The downstate part of Michigan is shaped like a human palm. Sometimes, if you ask Michiganders where they're from, they'll look around as if searching for a map or a piece of paper, and then just give up and raise their right hand as if swearing an oath, and point to the spot in their palm where their town is located. Detroit, for instance, is in the eastern part of the state, close to the crook of the thumb. My fiancé's house is in the heel of the palm in Kalamazoo, in a line straight below the little finger closer to the wrist. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan also resembles a horizontal hand hovering like a cloud over the rest of the state. It kind of goes like this. A few years ago, some guy made millions of dollars when he had the ingenious idea to make oven mitts with the upstate and downstate maps of Michigan on either hand. I'm not sure what became of him, the oven mitt millionaire, but I've wondered if he's since retired to gentler climes, as Robert James Waller did after he wrote The Bridges of Madison County, then quit his job as a college professor and retired to a spacious ranch in Texas. Now I spend part of the year in Michigan in a house that takes in water. I've observed that the state is an upside-down peninsula, surrounded by three sides by great lakes. If not for dependable Ohio and a few stubborn sand dune miles of Indiana, Michigan would be an island, floating untethered like a lily pad in the filmy marsh upon which the state undoubtedly rests. 7. Lately, I've been making the mistake of watching the History Channel, or, as I like to call it, Channel Countdown 2012. I liked it better when they stuck to actual history, or even things like the hydrological marvels of Roman engineering, or speculative history like the search for Sasquatch on every continent. But now the History Channel seems intent on only reporting the end of the world, based on the predictions of Nostradamus and the Mayan calendar. It's unsettling to watch some sober plate tectonic scientist from UC Berkeley speculate on how it might unfold, accompanied by animated graphics to demonstrate how the Earth's crust is like an orange peel, and how it could someday, perhaps someday soon, and almost certainly has already done so several times in Earth's history, just rotate and rearrange itself over the molten core of the Earth, landing Florida in Antarctica, Moscow in Idaho, Beijing in the Arctic Circle. For writers who take inspiration from landscape and the natural world, this could either be a very good or a very bad development. My first impulse a few years ago when I heard about 2012 and the end of the world was to say, my God, I have to finish my book projects. Then it dawned on me, wait, if the world is going to end, it doesn't matter if I finish my books, because no one will be around to read them. So we may as well spend what short time we have hanging out with friends, cooking, making love, drinking wine, as Epicureans advised us to do so many centuries ago. I've decided if the end of the world comes, I'm going as fast as I can, not to the floating palm of Michigan, or to Iowa, as solid seeming as it appears. I suspect it actually sits atop a mid-continent rift buried deep in the bedrock, a billion-year-old tectonic plate scar that stretches from Superior to Kansas. Instead, I'm going to my home state of North Dakota, to terra firma, where I'm convinced nothing bad can happen. Besides, I've seen my brother's gun collection. Or I'm going to Greece, where people have already demonstrated they can hang on to the cliffs and hillsides like billy goats for millennia and survive. 8. One of the things I found most fascinating about traveling in Greece is the way that each island or region you visit provides the tourist with a quick summary, a running account of the waves of oppressors who have vanquished the very ground upon which you're now standing. One can even point to the evidence in the local architecture, vestiges of city walls, the location of the moat, the construction of the stone streets, the fortifications on the hillside. Each in their own time, the Romans, Venetians, Ottomans, in the last century, Germans, Italians took their turns trying to vanquish the place. But here's the thing that gives me hope. It's the Greeks, still here, pointing to the architectural remnants and the battlements. It's the Greeks who are telling the story. Beyond the human story, perhaps, this is what I love about olive trees, the way they stretch into the longer view. The main point here is one of scale. the comparatively long life of even an ordinary olive tree provides a contextualizing backdrop, a temporal scale against which to measure the length of a human life. Greece's complexities mushroom the closer one looks at it. Geographically and culturally, it intersects with the Balkan Peninsula. Its islands are scattered far and wide through the Mediterranean, the Ionian on the west, the Aegean on the east. As such, it's a contact zone whose soils, geology, flora, fauna, not to mention culture, history, literature, language, myth, are so intricate that any fraction of one of these subjects has absorbed scores of scholars for entire careers. I worry, will I ever develop enough fluency in this place that I know in my own small way is Greece to write a human narrative set in it? Even though my main character is a stranger and not expected to know these things, I must know them. And there's another problem, cultural theft. Greece is a place from which much has been stolen. I worry, will I ever acquire sufficient disciplinary knowledge to earn the right to press my imagination into this place? To calm myself, I return to the thought of olive trees. If you grew up on an island in Greece, let's say Lesbos, in a house that bordered an olive grove, let's not say it's an ancient grove, let's say it's 400 years old conservatively. And if you had picked olives each year and your parents picked olives from that same grove and had cooked with the oil, and their parents had picked from the grove and made oil and used the oil for cooking and for lamps and as an emollient, and if you assumed or knew for certain that their parents and their parents and their parents' parents going back those 400 years conservatively had done the same, then how would that shape the way you felt about the house and the grove, about the village down the side of the hill, and about the people you met on that path each day? And let's just say there arose some dispute over the ownership of that olive grove, because a place that spawns so many generations naturally has to cast off members to preserve equilibrium, to send some of them to the cities and to other countries. And so let's say that one of those disgruntled cast-off family members decides to circle back and take a torch to that grove of olive trees, so that the land can be cleared and be made available for lucrative sale to Germans or Dutch retirees, or for development as a resort for tourists. If this were to happen in a wheat field or a cornfield, even on a Midwestern century farm in the U.S., the offense would be serious, but it might be recoverable. But if it happens to a 500-year-old olive grove, what are the relative equivalencies of the seriousness of the crime committed against the land and the family? I don't know these answers, but they are the questions that the writing of the novel is making me ask. 9. So I spend my summers now in a house in Michigan that has 2 sump pumps, one in the southeast corner and one in the northwest corner. In lighter moments, we refer to it as the boathouse. I don't imagine we'll ever be able to sell it. Sometimes we talk to our neighbors over the fence who have never had trouble with flooding and declare in voices sounding like Ma and Pa Kettle, "No siree, we're not leaving. We'll defend this clay seam till we die." To fix the water problem, we had to hire a crew to come in and jackhammer out the perimeter of the foundation so that they could lay a drain tile system underneath. After the pipes were laid and fixed in place, they cemented the foundation back over so that aside from a bit of discoloration in the concrete, you'd never know it. But it's alarming to have crews with jackhammers in your basement for 3 days and watch them carry out huge chunks of your foundation. And it's disconcerting to go downstairs and catch a glimpse of the earth that exists under your house, something you think you should never see. Maybe it's a little like watching your own brain surgery on closed-circuit television. So the drains are under there now, capturing the water that seeps around the crease of the footings, and the sumps flush it back out like one quick spit into the yard. It only took 2 years and about $20,000 to figure this out. Still, when it rains, we get twitchy. We stick close to home. We spend way too much time watching the Weather Channel. For peace of mind, last year for Father's Day, I bought my fiancé a gas generator large enough to power a small city. So if the power goes out, which it does in Michigan, and the backup batteries fail, we can always fire up the generator, which is louder than a chopped-out Harley. He rolls it out in the driveway and fires it up for a few minutes each month, and then he comes back in the house and says, Our neighbors must hate us. I remember the day we stood in the aisle at Home Depot with all the other Michiganders who were shopping for generators. We're preparing for the end times, we kept saying as a joke. But it didn't seem to strike anyone as funny. 10. Sometimes I think that the water is trying to teach me something. And if I would just have learned it and finished the novel, it would have stopped coming into the basement. I know that this is irrational. But I've been schooled by the elements. My first teacher was fire, which has appeared at junctures in my life, often destructively. There was the day that the grain elevator burned down in my hometown. And then there was the time when I burned down the inside of my mom and dad's car with a cigarette as a teenager. And then there was the time the gas stove in my first apartment blew up and singed my face enough to burn off my eyebrows and eyelashes. And then there was the night in August 1980 when my road band lost all of its equipment in a truck fire. $60,000 worth of equipment and no insurance, because who would be crazy enough to insure a rock band? In the hours following the truck fire, we experienced the loss in its entirety. We sat in a crying circle with our soot-covered road crew, who had all fortunately survived the accident. The next morning we visited the site to see the incinerated truck lying on its side in the ditch, looking like the burnt-out skeleton of a dragonfly. We sifted through the rubble for something recognizable, but found only a few dozen circular speaker magnets that were from our guitar amps and our PA columns, and they were strewn around the scorched periphery. The magnets had dropped wherever the fire had burned them free from their more ephemeral housings. All that remained from the fire was the motor of the truck, the axle, a bit of the wheels, and those iron speaker magnets, which were the only things made of materials strong enough to survive fire. It was astounding then to realize that all those solid things we had used to play heavy metal, microphones, power amps, drums, cymbals, guitars, most of the 24-foot truck itself had been reduced to ashes and charred bits, rendered unrecognizable by that hot gasoline fire. 11. A horse can live to be 40, a camel 50. A queen bee might get 5 good years, while a worker bee is lucky to have 1. The Amazon parrot can make it to 100 years, and the Galapagos land tortoise 190 plus under optimal conditions. An elephant has about 40 years, and an American alligator 56. What do humans get? Averaged out between genders in the U.S., we're at 77.9, which is 36th in the world. These are morbid deliberations, I know, but let me ask the question, why do we waste even one day of it? And what is the purpose of all this activity, these books we write, these utterances, scribblings, this breath that flows through the vessels of our bodies, shaping into words, songs, chants, prayers, curses, poems, stories? What does it all come to? After the fire, I began writing. I won't pretend to know how I picked up a pen and a piece of paper, but somewhere in those days and weeks after the fire, it occurred to me that while I had lost everything on the material plane, the idea of those things was still alive in me, growing more palpable every day. I had the words for them. I felt the separation from that life already, and I felt the way that language had stepped in to bridge the gulf. Writing it down must have been an absent-minded choice. The pen I reached for must have been the only thing that didn't cost money. I didn't even have a desk. I had a wooden cable spool I'd recovered from a ditch, which I'd turned on its side to make a table, and I had a candle on that table, so I lit it. I stared at the tongue of flame for a long while in the dark room as it weaved and dipped on its wick. Okay, I addressed the fire as if it were the quaking emissary of the conflagration that had destroyed my life. You got my attention. Now, what were you trying to tell me? And then I sat in the darkness for hours and did what musicians are trained to do. I listened for the cue to begin singing, for audible signs of what was happening around me. This is the beginning of what I know to be my life as a writer. And I mean to say here that I've tried all these years to keep listening in that way, to drag down into solid forms the words and phrases I would have preferred to sing, but am happy now to write. I hope there's still evidence of singing in my writing, even though I've spread out to subjects other than music. And I hope there's evidence of fire, a feeling that my sentences burned to be written, that they were forged from strong materials, and that they're capable of surviving the forces intent on destroying them once they make their way into the world without me. We are fragile creatures, short in our time, especially when matched against the cosmologies, the long temporal landscapes, the rougher geologies of the planet. Now, at 54, it's humbling to me when I think of it. But I can remember a time in my 20s before the fire when I cared about none of this. I was singing in a hard rock band, grating and shredding my vocal cords each night in smoky bars. And when my older sister took me aside and warned me that I wouldn't have a voice to sing with by the time I was 30, my response to her was, "Honey, I don't plan to be alive when I'm 30. Imagine this ephemeral life. Just when it starts to get really interesting, that's when it becomes clear that someday, perhaps someday soon, one will have to close one's eyes and look no more upon it, this awful beauty of the world." Okay, so can you feel a change here? There's a real shift happened here, yeah. So I have been working on this novel for a long time, set in Greece. This is a very short chapter, and it's about 8 pages, so it should go pretty quickly. We don't really get very far. It's hard to read from a novel, but I could tell you that the title of the title of the novel is "A Formal Feeling Comes." Some of you may recognize that as a line from an Emily Dickinson poem, and the longer part of the line is, "After great pain, a formal feeling comes," and this is a little epigraph from that poem. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow. First chill, then stupor, and then the letting go. A formal feeling comes. 1. The wake. The child ventured too close to the edge. Susan watched as a small girl planted a knee on the cushion beside her, grabbed the guardrail of the ferry, and pulled her willowy body up. She knelt there beside Susan now, her flat profile facing out to the blue expanse of sky and sea broken only by the layers of dark horizons of islands in the distance. The ferry dove and lurched through the swells, each time producing a spray of seawater that landed like a cold mist over those sitting on the upper deck. Susan had chosen this seat affixed against the upper deck's perimeter for a reason. It allowed her a direct line of sight to the storage bin with the international symbol for life preservers stenciled on it. She could not swim or float, believed she would sink like a stone if ever she found herself in water where her feet could not reach the bottom. "Oh, honey," her Thea Layla assured her once at a family gathering of her husband's relatives, "if the ferry goes over, just take a deep breath and kick your legs really fast. You'll just pop right up to the top." She didn't think so. Susan had abandoned her dry, comfortable seat in the lower aft deck when the smell of cigarettes and coffee, aftershave, and the oniony yeast of close bodies overpowered her. Seasickness may begin in the inner ocean of the stomach, but Susan felt it first as a furriness on the back of her tongue, something green and dark rising. She breathed in the cold air smell, sea salt, and algae, concentrated on pushing the sickness back down. Susan looked at the small girl who wriggled beside her. "Yasu," she said, "hello." The child turned to her, dark eyes, blank stare, thin smear around her mouth from a long-ago piece of candy. Susan resisted the urge to get out a Kleenex and wipe it. She smiled then at the old yaya sitting beside the child. She tried to remember the Greek word for granddaughter, but realized she had never learned it. They'd entered the cloud bank of wet wind and choppy water shortly after leaving the port. Corfu was shaped like a miniature Italy, complete with boot, drifting in the Ionian, northwest of the Greek mainland. The ferry navigated around the northern knob of the island, coming within a few kilometers of the dry white cliffs of Albania. The Alexandros was a small ferry, large enough for 300 people, a 6-car transport bay below. Unless the sea was glass, you felt every billow. Once they entered the strait en route to the 3 outer islands, and the pitch and roll really began, a steward of the Alexandros, dressed in a navy blue striped shirt and jeans, had moved through the decks, dispensing 1-gallon Ziploc baggies. He hadn't bothered to ask passengers if they felt sick. He'd only studied their faces, noting the level of bile in their cheeks, then handed a baggie to the condemned ones. When Susan and Donnie had made this trip 5 years earlier as newlyweds, they'd arrived at Erakuza, the island of Donnie's mother's birth, seasick, and with not one word of Greek between them. Blonde and blue-eyed, Susan was quickly forgiven for her new husband's by her new husband's relatives for not knowing the Greek words for bread, water, telephone, bathroom, much less olive, lemon, mountain, seashore. But Donnie, with his dark hair and coffee brown eyes, his Roman nose and olive skin that had caused strangers, even on the streets of Athens, to stop and ask for directions, was a source of consternation to his relatives. "Donnie, how come? No Greek?" Perhaps this is why Susan had refused the Ziploc bag that morning, determined to keep her stomach this time, convinced that her queasiness on the water was further confirmation of her un-Greekness, which was first among the many reasons that Donnie's mother, Mary, had never approved of her. Several others had chosen the upper deck, even in the storm. The old woman with the small child next to Susan wore a long black wool dress and shawl, black shoes, thick black stockings, clearly a widow, with white hair brushed smooth and pulled back into a tight bun. Each time the ferry bucked, the woman clutched the sick bag in her lap. Susan tried to avert her eyes, but she could see, so far, the woman had it about half full. 2 older men across the aisle from Susan spoke rapidly in Greek and shared their mid-morning collatio, gesturing and eating tropida, small cheese pies. Susan envied their strong stomachs. They looked to be brothers, same short, compact bodies, same hands, fingers gnarled from work, faces lined and darkened by the sun. She thought they must be arguing about politics. The word she heard most often was ohi, ohi. No, no. Clusters of women with bags and children had organized themselves in the center seating area of the deck, farther away from the spray. An Orthodox priest in a floor-length cassock with a tangled black and gray beard stood in the stairwell leading downstairs and talked on a silver cell phone. The older men across from Susan had gone silent, seeming to have finished their argument, along with their cheese pies. Susan smiled at them. Yasas, the one closest to Susan, smiled back. "We are trying to decide if you are German or Dutch," he said. "American," Susan answered. "So nice to hear English." "Ah, where from?" he asked. "Chicago." Not exactly true any longer, but it was harder to explain where Iowa was. The other man nodded and said something in Greek. Susan heard him repeat the word Chicago in accented English, Chicago. "My brother says he stayed in Chicago for a week when he was in the Merchant Marine." "Beautiful city," the other brother said. "Many bridges." "Yes," Susan nodded. "I lived in New Jersey," the brother closest to Susan continued. "Rode the train into the city for work for 32 years. He said this, then gestured around him, "so that I could come back here and retire." Susan nodded. She'd heard this story before. The exodus during the years of war, the hard work and prosperity of Greeks living and working abroad in places like the U.S. and Australia, always tempered by sadness, separation from home, and the hope of return. Donnie's mother, Mary, had made the same journey from Erakuza to Chicago, but had never wished for the return, not until the very end. On the other side of the deck, a group of 15 or so Italian teenagers had stationed themselves in the cushions along the perimeter. The girls were lovely skinned, wearing hoodies and jeans, braided leather wristbands, delicate beaded necklaces. The boys were solid-boned, dark-haired, long-lashed and beautiful as the girls, dressed in unbuttoned polos, jeans, and sandals. The Italian teenagers were on their way to a youth camp, summer camp in Othoni, the second in the chain of the small islands. Othoni was reputed among Greeks to be the island on which Calypso held Odysseus for those many long years. Susan had learned all this while talking with the teenagers' chaperones, a smart-looking Italian couple, while waiting for the ferry that morning in Corfu town. Now the chaperones were nowhere to be seen, perhaps smoking below, and the Italian teens were topside, spread along the perimeter in couples, not looking seasick at all, but instead kissing as the ferry careened through the waters. Even though the kissing was endless and passionate, something about the way the couples held their bodies at a distance from each other made it seem chaste. Their swan-like necks stretched toward each other, their faces pressed close, but their torsos held apart, as if engaged in some other business, like texting or doing crossword puzzles. Aside from their lips, nothing moved, tanned forearms resting on thighs, thin fingers held in mid-pose, grasping a dark wrist, feet planted. Susan missed her husband most at moments like this, the way he would have laughed at it without need for explanation. It was the one true gift of love, she thought, the affinity. The little girl beside her tried to rise to her feet now, unsteady, grasping the guardrail with her right hand and wobbling with the ship's motion. Susan turned and spread her left arm wide along the rail, as if embracing the shoulders of an invisible companion in order to check the girl's progress. Any moment, Susan expected the grandmother to call, "Ella, Ella, come here." But the woman was staring forward now at a spot on the pitching deck floor. Susan steadied the child with her right hand. She guessed the girl to be around 3 and not dressed warmly enough in a pink windbreaker, thin T-shirt and shorts. Her hair was wispy black, long and pulled into a ponytail. In the wind, escaped curls floated around the child's face in a dark cloud. She'd seen the girl below deck playing with a group of 7 or 8-year-olds twice her size. She remembered the child because her left arm was bound in a sling. Tiny wounded bird. Still, the girl had thrown her body with determination into the circle of bigger kids as they moved from seat to seat, pushed, shouted, ran up and down the corridors and the slippery ferry steps. Closer up, Susan could see that the sling was makeshift, a pink handkerchief wrapped around her elbow and forearm, and then looped over her neck. She wished she could say something to her grandmother, to the grandmother, about the girl's loveliness, but no matter how hard Susan had worked, she could not master whole sentences in Greek, only words and phrases, savoring each one she learned, holding it on her tongue like a gold coin, like fragments of the ancient world. But hero, heros, widow, widowed, this was a word Susan had been forced to learn in all its variations. Susan reached down instinctively and checked the location of the heavy backpack whose contents she'd carried on her shoulders through waiting rooms and security checks from O'Hare, into bathrooms, taxis, and planes. It now rested upright on the slippery floor beneath her seat. "Excuse me," the man across the aisle said. "Which island are you going to?" "Erakuza," Susan said. "We too," the man said. "I'm Tassos, and this is my brother Yorgos." He gestured to the other man. He said, "We are Katekis." Susan stared. She shouldn't be surprised. In Chicago, you'd have to look hard to find someone else with the name Kateki. Her mother-in-law insisted the name was meaningful, derived from the Greek word katecho, the word for to hold, possess, occupy, master. But try telling that to the store clerks, secretaries, and delivery boys who only wanted to know how to spell it. "That was my husband's name," Susan said. Tassos hesitated. "So you are Susan," he said. "Yes." The two brothers looked at each other. "Kostas told us you were coming," the older brother said. He glanced at the backpack resting at her feet. And then Susan realized that they knew it all. They knew that Donnie had gone back into the building to save his partner, and that he'd never come back out. They knew there was no body. They knew that Mary had gone to bed after losing her only son with no wish to get back up. On the other side of the deck, a layer of salt had begun to settle on the passionate Italian teenagers. They looked like sculptures captured in mid-kiss by some Renaissance master, skilled enough to make marble look as fluid as milk, as supple as skin. Beyond them, Susan thought she could make out the faint horizon of Arequiza as if through a gauzy mesh, the double hump of two mountains blending into the blue-gray of the sky. She turned to face the child, who was turned backwards in her seat, resting her chin on the guardrail, glumly looking out. Pelagos, Susan said, trying to draw the child's attention. She pointed to the unbroken blue. Thalassa. 2 words for the sea, and Susan could discern no difference between them. But she realized then that the child was not looking out, but rather down, below, at the point where the ship's bow was carving an incision through the water. Susan put her chin on the guardrail and looked down as well. Together they watched it for a moment, the wake, the way it spread wide around the ship's hull in lettuce ripples of white foam as the ferry pushed through, the way it resolved itself into waves of concentric lines, moving out and then dissolving again into the greater surface of the sea, once they'd passed through the vast opening that the ferry was making in the salty waters. Thank you. Thank you.
Deborah, thank you so very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take some questions. Don't be shy.
How did the truck catch on fire? Okay. Oh, that's such a long story because there was a big lawsuit that followed. But to make it as short as possible, we'd rented the truck from Ryder, and they rented it to us without a gas cover on the cover on the gas, cap. And so then they said, well, just pick one up along the way. Well, we were going to like state, little tiny county fairs and stuff, so we didn't have the opportunity to buy a gas cap for this huge Ryder truck. And on the very 4th night of our sort of small tour, our road crew ended up going in the ditch. It was middle of the night. There were 3 of them in the vehicle. They caught on sort of the shoulder of the road, and they went in. And they ended up taking an approach from the side. And, as luck would have it, there was an approach there. They sort of vaulted in the sky, landed, the axle broke, the truck fell on its side, it slid, and they had put a piece of plastic in a rubber band. Forgot to mention that. And so that came off, all the gas glugged out, and it started on fire, and it went very quickly. And those 3 guys, our road crew, they went and sat on a little hill and just sort of watched it burn and just cried and cried and cried. And so we ended up suing Ryder Truck Company, which was interesting. We were this sort of ragtag rock and roll band out of Fargo, North Dakota. They had, Ryder had like teams of lawyers in St. Louis, their corporate headquarters, and just blanketing us with all kinds of requests, for different, legal proceedings. And our lawyer was our drummer's brother, who had this little, 2-person law firm in International Falls, Minnesota, which is a hotbed of political, if you want to be a powerful lawyer, that's where you go, So, needless to say, it was a comedy of errors, really. Yes, go ahead.
Rock and roll versus such delicate wording. How does your previous experience in a rock and roll band inform your writing?
Well, and I'll rephrase the question because maybe not everyone can hear. How does my sort of internship as a rock and roll singer inform my life as a writer? I think that I was just talking to a student about it today. I apologize, Fred, if you're hearing this again. But when you learn to sing a song, and especially when you sing with a band that's playing at 120, 130 dBs, you really make that song kind of a part of your body. You have to invest in the song in order to get the song out. And you learn the words first and you learn the melody. This is sort of part of learning a song. And then there's that point, and we even have a phrase for it. We say we know it by heart, and that's really when you make the song kind of part of your body. And that's when you let go of the literal meaning of the words and you sort of live on the acoustic life of the language. You sort of ride on the vowels. And that's really when the language becomes something more than just, this word means this word means this, altogether they mean this. And that's when you can infuse phrases and, sentences with more meaning. And so I think that's one of the things I've brought over from being a singer, is that idea of always approaching language as a kind of acoustic artifact, always trying to remember that, that no matter how much sense the words make, there's a certain point where you kind of have to let go of the meaning and then kind of live more on the rhythmic and the acoustic life of the language. So I think that's maybe the biggest thing that I kind of brought over from music. Yeah. Yes. All right.
I enjoyed the two types of writing very much. They were very different, and it leads me to the question, what sort of feelings you have as you write the one kind of material, the informal essay, contrasted with the efforts that you exert when you're writing a novel. How does it feel to you internally as you work on those two very different types of writing?
Yeah, thanks for that question. This Dr. Richard Kaplan and his wife Ellen, who are here tonight from Iowa City, I really appreciate you being here. And I was thinking about Pearl Hogarth and what she would make of all this creative writing going on here at Iowa State. She was a teacher here many years ago who started creative writing curriculum. I think that for me, I really, again, to go back to song, I really started out with song lyric. And so going over to poetry was a natural kind of, migration. And for me, writing poetry is sort of pure joy. Like I can sit, that Csikszentmihalyi's idea of flow. You can sit there for hours and hours and hours and not know time is passing, and sort of forget about your body, and that's the way poetry is for me. I think I have the most fun writing nonfiction because you can sort of draw so many things in, and you can explain more. When you write a poem, you have to leave so much out. And for me, writing poems and essays together is really is productive because all the stuff I learn while writing the poem, I can then put some of that into the essay because you can kind of explain more in an essay, so you can be more expansive. And then to me, writing fiction is like, it's like digging ditches. I mean, it's so hard. We have some really accomplished novelists here in the room, and I've written short stories, but never a novel before. So this is a new experience for me, and we'll see if I ever manage to finish it. Hopefully, I will. But I was at a conference a few years ago. It was over at Iowa City, actually, and there was a discussion going on there, and they were saying, the poets are like the Air Force. And the fiction writers are like the army. They're on the ground, and they're and so it seemed like a pretty good metaphor to me because writing fiction is so much work. You have to make the room and put the shelves in there and put books on the shelves. You have to get people walking around. You have to dress them, and you have to get them to talk to each other. And it's like, God, you have to make so much stuff up. So. I suspect this will be my last fiction endeavor. But the story came to me as fiction, so I guess, that's... Yes, Barbara?
Why not?
So, in your essay, you let us know that this is a place where all these myths maybe were real events. And so, I wonder if you'll be using these already made up or already happened events in your novel.
Yes, yeah, yes. There are some underlying myths. that I've been studying for a long time. There's this amazing book by Roberto Calasso. I don't know if anyone is interested in Greek myths, but I really recommend it. He's an Italian publisher, Calasso, and he wrote this book called The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. And what he does is he starts out with Zeus, and then he sort of tells a story that everybody knows, and then he goes deeper, and he goes deeper, and he goes deeper, and he says, well, how did it begin? He keeps asking that question, then he goes a little deeper, and he finds these fragments and all kinds of things that contribute and really change the story. And so I'm really drawing a lot of inspiration from many of those deeply layered myths. And for example, I'm sure many people in here know this, but I didn't know it. I think because, well, I shouldn't say this, there might be some undergrads in here, but I wasn't a very good student as an undergrad. Let me just put it that way. So maybe I missed a lot of this, but anyway, we always know that, Aphrodite was born from Zeus's head, right? I mean, that's kind of what you learn. And she's been sort of a symbol of feminism, this idea of this woman who was sort of born from her father's head. She was born, she was in full military garb when she was born. And that's why Zeus's head hurt so much, because she was in there and she had to be born, And so reading Calasso, I discovered that actually the reason that she was born out of Zeus is not because he fathered her and mothered her, but in fact he swallowed her mother, Metis. And Metis comes from a long line of sort of tricksters, and Odysseus is one of that bloodline. And there are people who are great problem solvers. They can find their way through any kind of a maze or a problem, the aporia, and so they can make porous the unporous. And so that for me was this incredible moment when I discovered that myth and thought, floating around inside of Zeus was this consumed mother who birthed the child, and then the child came out of. And so that's the way for me the myths are making their way into the novel. I'm going to have little sections where I sort of retell things. There's a multivocality in the novel that wasn't evident in what I read tonight, but that kind of comes in at different points and begins to narrate these revised myths. Thanks for that question. Yes?
I was struck by your comment of not being able, excuse me, of not being able to write about Greece when you were looking at it, but writing about North Dakota.
Yeah.
And I wanted you to say a little bit about how you reconstruct in memory what you were experiencing. What is the difference between seeing it and living it, and then reconstructing it, later?
Well, with the nonfiction work, with my my family story, The Horizontal World, I was lucky because I have 4 siblings, and then, my mother and father and sort of a large extended family. So a lot of times, when I would go home, it seemed like all we would ever talk about is the things that I ended up writing about in my memoir. And so that's kind of cheating in a way, I suppose, because you have people around you constantly kind of telling you these stories. And so then it's the job of the writer, I think, to take them and begin to arrange them, to sift away that which is maybe unnecessary or extraneous, and try to figure out what to heighten. Maybe in the same way that, when you go into a recording studio, you have, guitar and drums and bass, and you sort of sit there and you manage the sound levels to create a kind of a soundscape where everything can be heard. And that's what I think writers do. They select these details that have floated to them. I have a system where I keep a notebook, and as simple as it sounds, so low-tech, I can't believe it, but I just jot things down in keyword phrases in the back of my notebook when they come to me, usually, driving or doing something that I can't be distracted enough to write it down, but I try to jot down a keyword phrase so I'll remember. So, like, for example, in my memoir, I discovered that there was an underground river under my hometown. And when I first discovered that, that ended up being an important and substantial part of my memoir, thousands of words, but it just existed for a long time in my notebook in a little keyword phrase, underground river, just sort of a little seed or germ waiting, so that I wouldn't lose track of it. In the case of the novel, a lot of the things that I described in that short chapter, really did happen while I was traveling in Greece. There really were these Italian teenagers who were, on the ferry just kissing and kissing and kissing. And I'd noticed that before when I travel in Europe. Have you seen it in Paris too? They'll be sort of kissing passionately, but their bodies, I just didn't describe, I couldn't get it right, but I will get it eventually. But they hold their bodies away and they just kiss and kiss, and then they just go, oh, ciao, and they sort of separate and go their separate ways off to class or whatever. And I wanted to capture that, and the image of the woman, Susan, carrying the heavy bag, which you probably know what's in that bag, but anyway, that's something that actually happened to me in an airport. I was getting on a plane in Grand Rapids, and this woman kissed this man goodbye, and they were sort of crying. And of course, I assumed, they were, lovers parting. And she went on the plane, and we flew to Detroit. We got off the plane in Detroit. I saw her again in the bathroom. And you know how it is, you say hello, like you don't know this person, but you're like, hi, you were on the plane, hello. And she had this heavy bag on the counter, the sink, and she just looked at me, and she said, my husband's ashes. And I just said, oh, I'm so sorry. How do you respond? So, and then what do you do with something like that? Seems like it kind of gets filed away somewhere, and then it comes back out, when you need it. Hopefully it comes back. Okay.
Over here.
And then we'll come here.
Okay.
And then we can, I'm sure people have, somewhere to go, so, yes.
Two things. One real quick about the lady with her husband's ashes. Sometimes when I hear that, or that a loved one is deceased, the only comment I can come up with is essentially that they now know what we only hope and pray is true, that there truly is everlasting life.
Yeah, I was puzzling that out a lot. I suppose my real subject these days is aging, and this this question about how much time do we have, how do we spend our time, what do we make, will it last, will it go on, especially because I don't have children, so I suppose people take some comfort in having children and having that sort of installment in the future, that legacy. But
at home, I have 2 computer files, and I don't remember which ancient Greek poet it was. It's either Homer or Plato. I'll say Plato. A professor at another university has discovered that in Plato's writings, he has mixed in with his words emotions and things to where it could be a musical tonation. And he has decided that if he had a musical score, let's say of extreme happiness will be a note at the top and extreme sadness at the bottom. And then as you read through his writings, if you made a note for every emotion, he played a song using words in there. And I was reminded of that when you talked about riding on the vowels and the rhythmic and acoustics of words. So I'll have those 2 files, and I guess if you haven't heard of that, I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
Because it's like music in words.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, and then I'll just go ahead and rephrase. And then that will be our last question. I'm sorry to keep you all so long. Yeah.
Now that you say you're over 30, are you still singing? Do you ever sing now?
Yeah, I do sing. My ex-husband Pete Manis is even after he wasn't my husband any longer, he was my guitar player. And now he's fallen in love, and he's moved to another city. So I've been working at learning how to play guitar on my own, which is, I'm really a bad guitar player. So it'll be a long process, but I'm really working now on developing kind of musical independence, so I can do music and kind of travel on my own and sing. And I'm doing songwriting all the time. Yeah.
There are some authors now that are putting CDs in their fictional books with singing. You could probably do that.
Yeah, well, like Water for Chocolate, I don't know if you ever, I think it was Laura Esquivel who did that with her novel, where she had a CD and it had classical music tracks, and she said, Chapter 2, listen to this track, Chapter 3. But I actually listen to music when I'm writing. I have a lot of world music that I've collected when traveling, instrumental mostly, and I listen to it a lot when I'm writing. And I notice that if I'm working on a piece of writing and I'm listening to a certain CD, if I go away from that piece of writing for months, but if I remember the music and I put the music back on, I'm right back there. And so there's something really important about the way that music works on the brain, different than language. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.